Hey guys, this is Mikro. I thought I'd make another video because the servers are down and these videos have been doing fairly well in terms and in this one I was going to talk about like how to actually improve and get to that next level of like where you want to be as a player no matter what like spot you're in currently. I guess like credential wise to talk about that, I come from a game called Overwatch which some people might have heard of. And that game I peaked rank 7 in the world for. So roughly in the 0.00002% of players is like when I was the best, and then from there on I transitioned to a coach, and then I was can apply these like principles to New World, and like if I look at like that I learned from Overwatch basically, and then from like recent tournaments with Overwatch in terms of like college scene, like a lot of these players I've worked with, like on this entire team, I've worked with basically every player. On this team, I've worked with like more than half the roster. On this team, I've worked with like 3 or 4 players, and like all these teams are doing like fairly well. And a lot of the people I've worked with have made it to Overwatch League, which is like pro esports, and I would consider myself to be like a semi-pro gamer at the moment. But that being said, that's not the main focus of what I do anyway, because the gaming stuff doesn't pay super well unless you're like the 0.00001%. So, but anyways, you could apply these concepts that I've like learned in Overwatch to New World, and I think a lot of them translate over. Uh, but the first step, and I guess as a coach too, because I was a player for a while and I transitioned to coaching, and then that's when I did I think better overall. Like the results here don't look as well as the players that I've worked with if you look at like the actual teams, because I've made a lot of players that weren't good very good, and I've made a lot of players make a name for themselves, and a lot of the people I've worked with are on top teams now. So, but anyways, in terms of like New World, uh, I think the first step, no matter what you're trying to improve in, like no matter what game you're in, is accepting that you're not the best. Because even if you're considered to be the best player in the world, there's going to be people that other people will consider to be as equal to you or maybe better in some aspects than you at some point. So there's always like stuff that you can learn, even if you're the top of the top. But if you're not the top of the top, there's still stuff that you well, there's a lot to learn then, and it's like a lot easier to find content to improve from. Like, and off of that, like you can see a lot from well, you can't see that much from stats, honestly. Like it depends on your role too. Like there's a lot of these stat websites now which are like kind of fun to play around with, but aren't actually super useful. Like if you're IGVG, because I'm gearing up towards more support class because that's how they play. The only thing that really matters is your assists and your deaths. You want low deaths and you want high assists. If you have high kills, that's great, but it really doesn't matter because that's not your primary job. If and I'm just using people that are like known to be good, I guess, as like using Dex Demon as an example. But like you can that's like one way to tell is like are you getting top of assists in your OPRs or getting top of your assists in wars? Like that's a good way. But before you even get to that point where you can get into wars, you have to like show that you're a good player and have the potential to be good in wars because wars are very exclusive in New World since it's 50v50 and for now people are just looking to slot the best players. The next patch hopefully more players will be able to get in with the changes, but I'm not fully convinced since people are planning to make alts and then just play multiple characters on the same server, which is cringe in my eyes, but that's what people do if they don't get told they can't do that sort of thing. And that's the direction that New World's going in. So, um, but on a more positive note, the first thing that you have to like look at is basically how to get better and like the I think the best way from like a casual standpoint to figure out like people to watch that are good and also kind of have fun along the way is probably watching this guy's stream called You Boy Willie. If you haven't heard of him, then you're probably fairly new. If you have heard of him, you'd probably know what I'm talking about. But this guy just streams really good wars all the time, like every day, and he just posts VODs on Twitch. So you just like you can go back and find someone that plays your role on those VODs, and anyone that he's spectating tends to be pretty good at the game. And then you can go to their individual streams and watch them after that, and try to figure out like what they're doing that you aren't doing, and trying to get better that way. So like watching war gameplay, watching OPR gameplay. Honestly, watching OPR gameplay is kind of weird. But you can do that. Like if you want to like watch a Dex player play OPR, you definitely can. It's just OPR. I think is more for practicing specific things at this point if you want to get better. Because it's such a different meta from more. At least in NA, and I know in EU, if you look at EU OPRs, they actually all just play like Bruiser, IGVG, IGBB. There's like very little Dex, so that's like a very different experience. But in NA, it's just like a Dex fest, so it won't be as useful. But there's still stuff that you can learn from it, right? Like you'd realize if you go into being an OPR and a healer, and the other enemy team has healers, and you don't, you're gonna die, right? So you take that to war. If you kill their healers, then you will just win the clump fight because their healers are dead. So, and that same concept like applies there. So there's like stuff that translates from OPR and 3v3s and whatnot. It's like the ranked experience in Overwatch or any other like competitive game. Like that will translate to team play, and that's the same thing for New World. There's like some other ways to practice. So I'd say OPR is a fairly good way to practice. If you're not getting into any wars, you definitely want to start with OPR and 3v3s and like duels. That's just like the primary way to get like experience. And you just once you get to the point where you're getting like you're winning most of your 3v3s with a pre-made or without a pre-made or whatever, or and you're doing very well in OPRs, like consistently getting near the top. That's when you start trying to figure out a way to like kind of brag about yourself, either post your stat lines or post like recorded clips or something along those lines, so that people are like, okay, maybe this guy's good. Because at the end of the day, you have to sell yourself to actually get into these wars. Like people aren't gonna like look for new players as much. Like a lot of the older companies are just gonna look for companies that broke up, that retired, that had good players, and then they'll grab those good players from those companies and integrate them into their company. And that's just kind of how it's gone, and why there's only a few really good companies so right now, because most of the really good companies have gotten the players from other good companies that have either quit or moved to a different server or something happened and they're no longer part of that roster. So you have to basically show that you're like worth that attention. I don't think anyone will be able to get to that point until they play like with a mediocre company for a while, or even what people would consider to be a PvE company. By that I mean the company that plays wars but that doesn't cap any points and just kind of plays to have fun. Like everyone has to start somewhere. The first company I was in, Full Nuts, which is not as active now, we lost 28 wars in a row before we won our first one. And that first one was Windsward, so like there's definitely a mental thing there. Like you have to know that like you're not gonna do well, but it will take time, and if you just keep working at it, you'll eventually get to the point where you could win a war. And at the end of the day, on attack, you just need the defense to make a mistake. I was thinking about making a defensive oriented war, but then I was thinking like for if I'm gearing this towards new people, it doesn't make a lot of sense because probably won't be able. But if you get to the point where you could have a defensive war, then you already have taken a territory and you're already past the point where this stuff is kind of relevant. Or at least I'm hoping so. But when you're starting out, I think you mostly focus on OPR, 3v3s, duels, etc. And in those circumstances, you want to be practicing what you would be playing in war, not just like a specific like duel build. Like there are a lot of really fun builds that you can play, and you could definitely play those. But at the end of the day, that won't be very good practice for a war itself. For war, CC is meta, or crowd control is meta, and then you also like a lot of empower stuff is meta, a lot of stripping cooldowns is meta. It's like all this like utilities, like what I would frame it as, is very popular, not just like super flashy things. Uh, like for example, like Dex players, like there's only like one or two slots for Dex every war, and like some people make like montages and they're like super flashy, but then there's only like two or three slots for these guys in a war, so it's like you can compete for that slot, or it can be like the utility player. If you are going to compete for that Dex slot, you have to be very flashy and very good at just killing people, and like even stuff that like doesn't actually make a lot of sense. As long as it looks flashy, you might just get an opportunity to play because people like to play with you or something along those lines. You're basically just bragging about yourself as how you end up getting started. If there was a ranked mode or a leaderboard, that would be a lot easier. Without that, you kind of have to just spam your shit in Discord channels, which is annoying. And like you don't want to do it too much, like you don't want to push that line too much, but you definitely have to brag about yourself to get the opportunity to play in those wars. But once you're getting in like a war or two a week, that's when you get to start like looking at some more advanced things. So rather than just watching other people's streams and seeing how other people play, then you're looking at like specific things that you can incorporate into your play, and you're recording your gameplay and then trying to figure out uh what you can do better and what the better players than you tend to do that you don't do. And those better players that do better than you that do what you don't do, that's a hard thing to find. Like Chun, for example, would be a very good IGVG. It's just his VODs are harder to find at this point. That's why I recommend Willie, because Willie's always streaming someone that has a good VOD. So just find someone that's like playing IGVG in here, IGVB, Great Axe, Warhammer, whatever you play, and then you'll have somebody to look at. And there'll always be a streamer usually that he's looking at. So then you can look at their stream and you can figure out from there who is actually going to be a good person to watch and kind of take some pointers from. A lot of the I don't think anyone in New World is like really perfect. Like people have these tier lists and they're like, oh, this guy's S tier, but the guy that's S tier still makes some mistakes usually. Like for a while, King I think was considered to be S tier for healers, but then people realized that King just stamped himself out and they started shooting King and he just died, and then he fell off like a lot harder than people expected him to. And just like everyone's like, no one's really perfect. If people are doing better than someone else, it's usually because they're abusing some aspect of the game, not like from a cheating perspective, but they're finding something that they can do that no one else can do, and then they're just using that to their advantage. But I think stats in general are a good way to do that. Like if I look up Chun, then he's probably considered to be the best IGVG in the game still. And he has like very low deaths, very high assists, and he has some like really good records. But like you also have to take in mind like who he's playing with. Like if you're playing with Supple and you have like a 414 assist record, this is just like a far more, and it doesn't really mean anything. Which is why these stat websites are not very good in practice, and why companies favor VODs so much more. But if you're at the point where you can't even get like a war VOD, that's when you have to show that you're good enough to get into a war from like OPRs, 3v3s, duels, or just be like good at networking. But then also, like, if you get a shot, then you kind of have to use your shot well. So you want to be at a point where you're confident that you will be able to do well before you just kind of throw your name in a hat. Like, you definitely can just throw your name in a hat, and there's not much to lose sometimes. But if you don't do well right away, people won't prioritize you. But if you do pretty well right away, then people might be like, okay, this guy, and you show that you're like good in OPR and stuff like that, then people are going to be like thinking that you have potential, and then they'll keep trying to get you in wars and try to make you a better player and stuff like that. So, but in general, in terms of like improving yourself, like if I'm watching, like I don't know, let me just pull up a random VOD from Willie's stream. Probably gonna get hit with an ad. I am not. But if you're just like watching some, okay, this is his bruiser gameplay. But if you're just watching some like random war, and you're just like watching this player just to watch this player, that's like one thing. I'd consider that to be like enjoying something. Like when I watch like a competitive esports match, I'd be watching it to enjoy it. But then if you're watching it in order to improve, you're looking at like one specific thing. Like how does this guy use stamina, for example, would be like a specific thing that you would look to improve upon. It's like, oh, he's never gray barring. Which a lot of new players will be on like gray bars most of the time. If you're on a gray bar, you can't dodge, which means you can get bursted. And those iframes and that stamina management's really important from a war perspective in order to stay alive. So I wrote down like some things that could be used to like, and this is like some of the other notes I had, but I wrote down like some things that could be used to like help with these. So on top of like the OPR 3v3s, 1v1s, there's like if you have a company that you're in that's like working to improve, then you can do company OPRs and have everyone queue at the same time. Those are very fun. Company duel nights are very, very productive if you could set them up right. It's just hard to get a lot of people at the same time in the same place, but if you can do it, it's really good, and you don't need that many people. You only need like probably 10 to 20 people to run one of these. And so I guess it doesn't even have to be company at that point. You could just get like 10 to 20 friends. It's just that can be hard sometimes. And then like from a company dual night perspective, there's like a couple drills that you can do. 1v1s are always good. That's like a normal drill. especially if you're doing it in like war specs. Like it's not as useful, but it's still like very fun, and you can definitely learn some things like stamina management. You can definitely learn in a 1v1, and like how to lay your abilities. You can definitely learn in a 1v1. And then from that, 5v5s is like a fairly natural progression. You get some synergy with your group. You could also do Q as a 5 and OPR and get synergy with your group that way. That's a good way to improve. One thing that we did a lot that I think no one does for some reason, but I think it's like one of the best things that came out of that original company I was in, is we did like a 2v1 healer drill. So we'd have two people trying to attack one healer, and then we would basically judge how good our healers were by how long they could live. And there'd be some healers that would die within like 5 to 10 seconds, right? And then there'd be other healers that could like live for a minute and a half without having to heal anyone. And it's like if you're at the point where you're living more than like 20 or 30 seconds with this drill, then you could probably progress to this 3v2 style, which is more advanced, where you have a healer that's focused on living and also healing someone, and that person that's healing or that's with the healers focusing on protecting them. And usually when you're doing these drills, you are letting people use consumes, which can be expensive, or you could use like tier 4 ones or tier 3 or like lower ones. But the reason why you're doing that is because you want to form those habits for war. So if you do everything without using consumes, and then you go into war and you're like, oh, I have all these consumes, then you're probably doing something wrong. Like in a war, one of my things I had to improve upon recently was I was using 440 region pots of war, which sounds like a lot, but then everyone else is using like around 50. And when you use like regen pots off cooldown, that's basically the same thing as standing in a sacred, so it actually helps you live a lot better. And then once I did that, I immediately like shot to the top of the leaderboard and was like, oh, it was just that simple. Like there's like little things like that that you might not notice. Other people notice from your VOD too, so having other people watch your gameplay and watching other people's gameplay helps as well. But the main thing is you want to find like one specific thing to improve on and focus on that, because if you look at everything, it's going to be overwhelming at the same time. Like when people critique you and like look at your VOD to get into a war, then they'll be looking at everything. But as when you're improving upon yourself, you want to only look at like one thing at a time. Otherwise, there will be too much to incorporate and improve upon. Like you look at one of these things per day, for example, if you're like really, really try harding in a game and trying to get competitive. But if you're looking at if you want to get to the highest level, then it's like people are going to judge you by your overall picture. So like some examples of things I wrote down that are like general things I see: cooldown usage, like how you use your abilities. Like if you got that refreshing frost perk, you probably want to use it. You probably want to use your abilities in ice, so you get the refreshing off. So if you don't, you leverage that, then that's a problem. Playing off people in your group, so like group synergy would be a thing. So that would be a thing that would be improved upon by 5v5s, queuing OPR with other people, doing dual nights, being in the same voice call and actually talking to people. Like that's something that NA in general is worse on and EU's a lot better with. Like if you watch Micah EU, I think his name is, or something like that. Like, yeah, this guy. Like this guy, I don't think people consider to be the best player in the world, but he's like he shows off really good comms and what those comms should be. Like they're borderline too much, but like if you watch one of these VODs, this is like the level that the best companies or the best company in EU is at, where they're talking like all the time about who's using what cooldowns when, playing off each other. Like that's something that everyone can improve upon in NA. It's also harder though in NA because they don't keep consistent 5-mans and the EU does, which I don't understand. But yeah, it's something that could be looked at and probably will be easier once the changes come about, where you're kind of playing within your company more for wars. And like when you're doing all this and like doing all these dual things, like you can approach it from like a group perspective, like you're trying to get better as a group, or you can approach it from an individual perspective. In general, if you're getting tilted at other people because they aren't doing as well as you hope, then you want to like look at just your own gameplay. Because if you look at other people's gameplay and they don't want to improve, then they're never going to improve. So you can't change other people usually. Like if you argue about someone that says, like if you try to convince someone that the Earth is round and they think it's flat, then sometimes it's just like pointless. So it's like don't do that and just like focus on yourself. Positioning would be another thing that's very important. Like if you watch some of the most competitive wars, there's healers even that stand on point at certain times. Like healers will get on the point just to help the tick speed up, and then they'll get off when they know they can't be there anymore. Like there's a very high skill gap in terms of positioning that people don't realize, and it'll be even more important next patch with Quen's pots getting reduced. Gear is important. sadly. I only run 2 perks. I do well with 2 perks. You could definitely just run 2 perks, but the people that have 3 perk gear is, well, I don't only run 2 perks, but I run like cheap 3 perk or good 2 perk gear. And like gears definitely gives people an advantage, but that's because we're in an MMO. And that's just how it is. Consume management, like when you're popping your cooldowns or you're popping your cleansing pot before you pop your healing pot, or you're popping your healing pots inside of a sacred so they get more use. Tunnel vision, tunnel visioning is like a really big one that you see with like newer people, like experienced people. You'll see them like shaking their mouse around all the time, and they're just like trying to keep track of everything in their head because it's a 50v50, and if you focus on like a 1v1 and a 50v50 and you get blindsided by like 5 people, then you're trolling. So you gotta like figure out a way to look at that. That's something I'm still improving on, but that's like a definitely a general thing that can be looked at. Target priority. This comes back to the debate I think I started in the first video with this, where it was like pad versus pressure. If you're hitting people in a sacred and they are not taking any damage, you're probably looking at the wrong spot to like be in, or you're in the wrong spot. You want to be forcing cooldowns and like actually seeing their health bars go down. So that's like a target priority thing, and that applies to like every class in the game. Like you need multiple people to be able to kill someone through a sacred, or you can hit someone that's not in a sacred. And then I guess finally, once you think you're decent enough to get into a war, you're confident that you can do decently well. So that's like after you play a bunch of OPRs, like you're probably at the 100 to 200 mark to be honest, and then you show that you're good. Then you're looking at trying to figure out a way to get noticed to actually get in these wars, because they are exclusive, just by nature of how warring works. So posting like clips, like recording yourself, making like dumb montages and clip dumps, like all this stuff like helps. Also, stat lines help as well. Even though stats don't matter, stats do matter because stats get you noticed. Like if you like when I'm talking about this pad versus pressure, when you want to get a tryout, definitely look at pad. When you want to actually win, then look at pressure more. And when you're submitting a VOD, submit a VOD of pressure, but submit stats when you're padding, which is gonna sound like an awful thing to say, but you're trying to game the system for yourself. And if you want to get more stats, you want to play a pad. But if you want to have a bigger impact in a war, they need to be playing for pressure. So that's the problem with mercs in general, is mercs will look to pad versus company members will do pressure. So then company members are like, oh, my company member isn't doing as well, but they might be they're either worse at the game, which is honestly more likely, uh, with the current state of the new world, or they're just like not putting their damage in the spot that gives them the most stats. So like this is like probably the biggest debate in New World, like what is pad, what's pressure. I'd say if you're submitting a VOD to a good company, they'll definitely tell or be able to tell what is pad, what is pressure, and they'll slot you according to it. There are some roles where it doesn't really matter if you're padding, like IGVG, it doesn't really matter if you're padding. But if you're not playing off bruisers at all too, then that's like a specific kind of IGVG slot, and it's like not as common. It's like that's a Dedi point IGVG slot, and there's not many of those that are used at the moment. So that's something that's definitely could be looked at. So posting stats, like this, trying to sell people that you're good. This is like the biggest thing I'd say. Like it could be very general. Like trying to duo with someone that you know is in the best company in OPR and then get them to vouch for you so you get into a war or something like that. Like you definitely take advantage of people to get those opportunities. And then I guess lastly, the because stats don't really matter, the only way to judge if someone's good or not is VODs. So if you're not recording your gameplay and you're trying to get into a war, I've seen players that get insane stats and are consistently good get not slotted for a war because they aren't recording VODs, and get a different person gets slotted for that spot because they're recording VODs. Like it's very important, and unfortunately that's very hard with New World because it's just not a great game. Like in terms of coding, like on the computer I'm on right now, like I'll get 20 to 40 FPS in a war, and you just have to deal with it and figure out a way to play with that and like optimize your settings. But it's just kind of the state of New World at this point. In terms of like clip dumps, like there's a lot of examples of them. I'd say Faint was probably the OG person to start this like 7 months ago or 9 months ago with like the whole ice spike thing. It's like something like really dumb and flashy. If you're playing a support build, you're not going to be able to like show off as much as the DPS builds. I think the DPS builds are just better examples. Like a support thing would be like in a recent war I had, it was like 99.9%, and then I killed like 10 people at the same time, and then we won that. And that's like a thing I post, and it's like, oh my gosh, this guy's insane. He's gonna get slotted over and over. And it's like, yeah, if you can make those plays when it matters, that's at the end of the day what gets you slotted and more. And it can make up for some of the stat stuff too. Like if you're not a perfect player, but you're making plays, then that's what matters at the end of the day. It's all about winning the wars. It's not like how you win the wars. And that's what you determine from VODs, right? That's why stats aren't as important. It's just you need some degree of stats before you can get to the VOD state. Like you have to be a decent OPR player before you can just get slotted for wars. And OPR is a dex fest, and it's annoying, but you have to figure out a way to get to that point where you can get slotted for wars and then do well in the wars that you're slotted in enough to and leverage that to get slotted for other wars, which is really hard because mercs are so open right now. Like you will probably get in a loop for a bit where you're stuck with a company, and that's okay as long as the company is like looking to improve. You guys will get better with time, and hopefully people will be able to hold less territory next patch, and you'll be able to get more reps in and get better that way. Because it's really hard to improve in wars without actually playing the war itself. But there's like a lot of fundamentals that you can learn in OPR and 3v3s that can't necessarily be taught that you can use in wars. Like you try to teach someone how to ice spike like Feint was in this meta, and they'd be able to do it, but they wouldn't be able to do like his stats that were being done in wars, which I think he had at the beginning here. It's like when ice spike came out, Feint was getting 40 to 50 kills consistently in wars, which is just like unheard of. So, and I think at a certain point he peaked at like 60, but no one will really be at that point where it's just like that insane. But if you're getting top assists consistently, then you just will get noticed with IGVG in general and IGBB as well. IGBB, the assists matter a little bit less than IGVG. It's more about low deaths. And if you're playing 150 conversion, then it's also about like your kill to death ratio. Like if you get 20 kills and only have 2 deaths, you're a very, very good slot. But if you get 3 kills a war and you have 10 deaths, then you're not a very good slot. So it's just like finding a way to work on that and get better that way. But I think this is good enough for now. If people have like specific questions, let me know. VODing, that's why this whole channel started in the first place, is I just literally posted VODs so I could watch them in bed because I didn't want to watch them on my computer. And I was lazy. And it's just like you start simple with that, and that's just where you get to at a certain point. It will take time, it won't be instant, but hopefully with the new patch it will be easier to get opportunities to show that you're good. And yeah, I'll try to think of more things to talk about, or someone let me know if they have things that they want me to talk about, and go from there.